and gentlemen, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Heiko Khoo. I'm your prospective parliamentary candidate for the constituency of Putney in London. And since the election was called and since I put myself forward as a candidate, I want to tell you about the processes that happen in this apparently democratic country. So the first thing to note is that when you stand, of course, you're given, you have to get 10 names to put your name down to get in the election, which is quite easy to do. Then I asked the returning officer or the council officer responsible for organising the election for a list of meeting places where I could hold meetings about my campaign and also to debate with the other candidates in the campaign. Because I do not believe that it is adequate in a general election, electing something like 600 candidates, for us to be glued to the television and to make our decisions based on what Rishi Starmer and Keir Sunak declare. I do not believe that they represent either the general political process in society or the views of the general public or even the views of their own political parties. I have good reason to state that they represent the interests of a tiny elite who control power in this society, whether or not Rishi Starmer or Keir Sunak becomes the Prime Minister. I do not believe that the democratic process that I am engaged in at the moment in Putney and that the country is supposed to be participating in will be decided, or better said, should be decided by what happens on a couple of television hustings. So to that end, I have called in my constituency, which according to the Representation of the People's Act 1983 guarantees all candidates the right to use meeting rooms paid for at government expense. In other words, schools, colleges, libraries and other public venues. I was given a list of these venues by the council officer responsible for the election. Then when I called them up and emailed them, the trouble began. Rather than the election being designed around having the people in the constituency attend meetings to discuss and debate with the candidates and parties standing in the election, the entire infrastructure to facilitate public meetings has been destroyed. So rather than have actual positive engagement, it has been destroyed. The possibilities have been undermined and destroyed. And therefore I've been compelled to use hook or crook to gain my legal right to stand in this election and to hold meetings and hustings with the other candidate. We'll come to the hustings in a minute. There were 2 hustings last week in our election in our constituency of Putney. The first was in a church in Roehampton. The church arranged this meeting and the chairperson was a local political, or better said, a bureaucrat figure.
Church political.
No, I don't think it was a church believer. A bureaucrat figure. And they had a reasonable attendance of about 100 to 150 people. And it was advertised in the local community. And each candidate got 2 or 3 minutes to speak on all the issues that have affected us for 5 years. We speak for 3 minutes. Then you get questions selected by the person who's the chair, selected in advance without us knowing what they are. And then those questions you get to answer for 1 minute, 1 minute each, in order to deal with all the questions that have affected the local area, the city, the nation and the world. And by God, we've had a lot of issues affecting the world in the last 5 years. We had first, when the election took place, within weeks, we had lockdowns imposed on Britain and the world. Nearly all of the world was locked down. Not only for a week or two, but on and off, people were locked down for up to 2 years. In other words, house imprisonment was imposed on the population of Britain and much of the world for 2 years. And yet, when Rishi, Starmer and Keir Sunak were interviewed last week, there was no discussion about the lockdowns, about their relevance, about the power grab, about the coup d'etat, about the silencing of opponents, about the arrest, imprisonment, charging, beating up of those who disagreed with what was taking place, even though all the evidence has proven that we were right and they were wrong. We stood here and were arrested, were attacked, were imprisoned, were detained, were fined, were charged, were treated in the newspapers, on the television, in the radio, on social media. We were banned. On the radio, television and newspapers, we were smeared. Tin hat, COVID deniers, conspiracy theorists, liars, anti-vaxxers. The Merriam-Webster dictionary says an anti-vaxxer is a person who opposes vaccination or who opposes mandatory vaccination. And they tried, and I think that means all of you are anti-vaxxers. And they tried in the last period of COVID, beginning of 2022, they imposed a mandate on all social care workers, abandoning the elderly, sacking the people that were essential to their care, abandoning them in their thousands as people on terrible conditions were sacked because they didn't have a vaccination. Then they came for the NHS workers, and a demonstration took place in London by 100,000 organised by the 100,000 NHS workers opposed to compulsory mandatory vaccination for those workers. And the government suddenly capitulated. They said this is an NHS demonstration. It was actually an anti-lockdown demonstration on a regular basis that happened every month for nearly 2 years. And the newspapers and television suddenly said this is an NHS demonstration. And then they all began to wring their hands. Maybe the policy can be changed because of the new variant is less deadly and everyone's been vaccinated and the vaccination helps. But we know now, the British Medical Journal published an article, peer-reviewed article, studying excess deaths since 2020, and they have not been able to account in 49 countries in the Western world. They have not been able to account for why there are so many excess deaths after the vaccinations and after the end of COVID, or the so-called end of COVID. Why are there still so many excess deaths in all age groups? Now, correlation is not causation, but the inference from the British Medical Journal article and from hundreds of scientific studies in the last 2 years since the vaccinations were rolled out are condemnatory of the experimental mRNA vaccines that they rolled out and jabbed, not only to the vulnerable, who were possibly made more vulnerable, but also to those who would not be affected, also to those who had already been infected and had developed natural immunity. And worse still, the worst crime against humanity that they carried out was to inject children from 12 years of age with or without their parents' consent. So So I say to you, whether you are vaccinated or unvaccinated, a crime was committed during that period with vaccinations. A crime was committed in the lies they told you to justify getting the vaccines. And a crime was committed against your children, against the elderly, against all of the population by locking us up and without any charges at home, by arresting those who broke the regulations unless they were members of Downing Street entourage, and by forbidding people whose parents were dying in hospital or in care homes from having their family members hold their hands as they passed away. That barbarism was even helped along, as we know from the evidence, even helped along by the injection, by the giving of midazolam and morphine, a deadly end-of-life cocktail to people with respiratory distress. That combination, midazolam and morphine, which Matt Hancock specially ordered for the COVID crisis, that order, that provision, what does it do? Midazolam and morphine represses breathing. When you've got pneumonia, bilateral pneumonia with glass-like opacities in both lungs, which was how COVID was originally identified, you give them midazolam and repress their breathing. What will be the result of that? And they didn't even protect the hospitals. I remember speaking to an NHS doctor working on the wards in Bristol during the course of November 2020. And she told me one day, it was a Wednesday, one person has got COVID in the hospital, and they cut the beds in the hospital from 1,000 to 500 to make space so you're not too close together. They didn't bother opening the windows though, just in case you thought they might be worried about a respiratory illness. And then she told me on Saturday, so this was Wednesday, by Saturday 250 patients had got COVID, testing positive. And by the week after, half of the patients in the hospital, even Captain Tom, by the way, remember that man, he marched up and down in his garden to save the NHS while we all clapped. And that man, they said, is a hero of the country. They didn't tell you, or they barely told you, it was only in one or two small pieces in the news. He did not catch COVID at home and go to hospital. He came into hospital with one illness and he caught COVID and died shortly afterwards in hospital. So much for their concern about us catching COVID. So much for their concern.
People die in the hospital, not at home. That's what happened.
Well, he was sent home. He was an exception. He was sent home. A good friend of mine died at the time, my colleague, and his partner came to see him, and she'd already had the illness. She was immune. She came to see him at hospital on the Tuesday before he died. And you know what they told her? In order to see your partner of 40 years, you must wear a hazmat suit. So 2 days before he died, she saw him with a visor through a hazmat suit. And she said, "Can you recognize me?" He said, "Only just." And when that moment happened, and life, the wobbling between life and death in the case of respiratory illness can shift from moment to moment. There's nothing that says you have to die of a respiratory illness if your basic bodily health is reasonable. And yet,
battery. I think this is going to,
if you spread fear, if you spread panic, if you make people fear they're about to die, and you take someone with a hazmat suit to see them, you're implying you are going to die. And then it becomes, at least partly, a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the truth. So fear is one of the greatest destroyers of the human immune system. And how many people in Britain and the world were in fear? Fear of touching this, fear wherever they went to wash their hands, fear with a mask on in the tube, fear to go out of their home, fear to visit their family, fear to visit their friends. All of this, which I know all of you, I can see whether you agree with me or not, all of you experience this, and yet it is not a subject for debate in the election. How can that be the case? How can what happened to the world not be a subject for debate in the election? I ask you, what sort of fraud is that? And Rishi Starmer was interviewed 2 days ago. The first interview, you know, Wooden Tops, the one who's come out fighting now. So the young woman interviews him and he speaks over her to show how tough he is and how determined. You know, I used to lead, my dad was a toolmaker, and I used to lead the Crown Prosecution Service. That's how good I am. That's why you must trust me. And I kicked Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party, and that's why you've got to trust me. I've changed Labour. Now I'm going to change the country. What a lot of poppycock and nonsense. Absolute and complete nonsense. And was he asked? Was he asked about the seminal issue of our time? Was he asked about the mass slaughter taking place live on television every single day as this election takes place? He was not asked a single question about Gaza. Yet he said at the beginning, he stated, he made his mark and stated, I believe that it is justified to cut off the water and power to the innocent people in Gaza. That's what the Labour Party said. That's what Keir Starmer said. So in other words, he is an advocate and a promoter of genocide. And by the way, has he opposed Britain selling weapons, sending troops? There are British aircraft flying over Gaza and passing reconnaissance to the Israelis in order to target young children and women and blow their bodies up. Nearly 100,000 have been maimed or injured or killed. Some 40,000 have been killed. 70% of them women and children. And yet not even a tear drops from the eye of Rishi Starmer and Keir Sunak. Instead, they declare that anybody who marches on the streets in London to protest against genocide, to protest against slaughter, anyone who marches against this is a hate marcher and a defender of Hamas, a defender of terror. And yet the terrorists are given weapons by Britain, America and Europe, not only in Gaza. When the COVID story came to an end, it was replaced, of course. You always have to have some story, some dust to throw in the eyes of the population and stupefy them with nonsense. What is the latest dust? Well, it started, I'd say, the dust they began to shift the emphasis from COVID. You can't catch something through your mouth, but you can catch something through your ears and your eyes. You can catch the idea that the war in Ukraine is a just war to protect the freedom of the Ukrainians. The British government, the European governments, the American government could not give two hoots about the Ukrainian people. No. They send weapons, they send laser-guided missiles, they advise them, they scupper the peace deal in April 2022, and they're prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian man in order to win this war against Russia. We should be allied with Russia in making deals with oil and gas to provide the people of Britain with higher living standards. China is now our enemy. We should be allied with China. Get the children learning Chinese, exchange visits. Get people helping with the development of China and Chinese helping with the development of Britain. Not on the basis of saying, I agree with the politics, but on the basis of saying, we are humanity and we have a common interest in development of living standards, of welfare and of peace and security around the world. Instead of this, we are told we are preparing in Russia for war with China. And of course, I suspect that's why they're still so closely in bed with Israel, despite Israel committing genocide and war crimes backed by the British. And therefore, my experience has told me that as you're not allowed to say these things on television, George Galloway, by the way, he was elected in February this year. He's got a party standing 130 candidates. When was he on the leaders' debates? When have you seen him on television? When have you seen him even in the betting odds? Who's going to get elected? For example, in Putney, they've got the betting odds. I'm not on it. They don't even list the candidates for the Workers' Party. Why don't they do this? Why don't they do this? Because they know very well that actually anyone who has followed British politics in the last 5 years and more knows the Israel lobby is a powerful lobby in Britain. They ran a sabotage campaign from 2015 onwards to remove the Democratic elected leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who now has been expelled from the Labour Party and was compelled to stand as an independent in this election. So to say that Keir Starmer changed the Labour Party, it's not true. Keir Starmer, on behalf of Israel, changed the Labour Party. And anyone who disagreed with the leadership or the commands of Israel was declared to be an anti-Semite. So knee-jerk is this reaction that when I spoke at the hustings on Tuesday morning at South Thames College, and I compared the Israeli slaughter in Gaza to the Nazis in Germany, who Israel was founded supposedly to oppose. When I made that comparison, which all of you understand is not anti-Semitic, it's a question of fact. Is Israel behaving like the Nazis? Yes, it is. And then Fleur Anderson, the former incumbent member of Parliament, turned round, frothing at the mouth, jumping up and down. That's anti-Semitic. How can you allow this? She wanted to stop me from speaking at the hustings debate, where I have a legal right under the Representation of the People Act to express my point of view. She wanted to prevent me from speaking. So psychotic is the dictatorial impulse of the leaders of the Labour Party. So we have called in Putney for a revival of an ancient tradition, the tradition of democracy in Britain. And most of you may not know, but I will inform you now. The idea that everyone should have the right to vote. Every person, well, every man it was at the time, but the implication is clear that women later would be the question that would follow. The right to vote for men was debated and discussed first in 1847. Actually, the meetings ended on my birthday on the 9th of November in Putney St Mary's Church, where there will be hustings on Tuesday and I will be debating. I asked the church to rent the building for another meeting. The church vicar said, we don't believe we can't be associated with the idea of something that might be considered not impartial. I am not proposing partial debates. I am proposing totally impartial debates, but not 3 minutes and 1 minute. I want us to debate the real issues that have affected society in the last 5 years. So we are proposing this list of debates. These are the ones I've been able, against the will of the buildings concerned. These are the ones we will be calling. General hustings will be in St Barnabas Church, Southfields, on Monday. Another general hustings in St Mary's Church, Tuesday 7:30 on the 18th. Another general hustings in Granard School, Cortis Road in Roehampton. Another general hustings at the Open Door Centre in SW19 at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Then we will discuss the following agenda at the Putney Library on Monday. Capitalism, socialism, liberalism, nationalism, what are the philosophies of the parties? economics and inequality, the cost of living crisis, what are the views and issues behind it. So we discuss a theme, go into depth, bring the public into debate, not just sit them at home to watch the nonsense on television and have Keir Sunak, Keir Rishi Starmer anointed as King of England. That's what the mass media, under control, partly of the Israel lobby, partly of financial and economic interests of a tiny elite that control the world, and partly of a British capitalist class who control the mass media and the news outlets in Britain. We need democracy at the grassroots level, involving the people in every constituency, every town, every village, to debate the issues that affect our society. So we've launched a website, and we will, sorry I haven't done it yet, tonight. The website will be putneydebates.uk, and if you want to follow my own activity for the Workers' Party as a candidate, you can look up putneyworkers.org. putneyworkers.org. Come to the debates. We will stream the debates. That's another thing. They didn't allow us to stream the debates either on Monday or Tuesday. Given the fact that we live in a modern technological world, all the debates, all the views should be aired and streamed to the population. So we are trying to revive the fundamental concepts of democracy from 1647, when actually they called for biannual elections. And Lilburn, on behalf of the Levellers, he called for all men to have the right to vote. And of course, in modern times, that means all men, all women, not only the right to vote, but the right to participate directly in democratic debate. And let the debates go on as long as required for the people to be satisfied that their questions have been answered and the views of the candidates have been clearly expressed. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Vote for the Workers' Party.
Hold it and start again.
Ladies and gentlemen, Piers Corbyn! Not yet.
Oh, in a second.